Well, tonight we finish our second segment in the material, which is the people of the wilderness. And as Roy's prayer just brought to our minds some things that we've been talking about this quarter, about how life on this earth is similar to the Israelites' experience in the wilderness and some of the difficulties and hardships that they dealt with. In a similar way, we're going to face those same kinds of difficulties and struggles. There may be differences in particular elements. Of course, none of us are banging on rocks with rods expecting water to come out, but there are times of struggle. And the New Testament says that Christians are making our way through a figurative wilderness in this world. And so that's been our focus this quarter. Tonight we're talking about the mentality that we need as pilgrims, as people who are making their way through this wilderness. We understand that the Israelites were not supposed to stay in the wilderness for as long as they did. Because of their faithlessness, their disobedience, they were forced, they were punished, and they had to stay in the wilderness for a lot longer than was intended. But that wilderness experience, as long as they stayed there, no matter how long they had stayed there, whether it had been 6 months or 1 year or 40 plus years as it ended up being, going through the wilderness helps us appreciate home all the more. And I closed your material with a point to ponder that came from a quote that came from someone you might recognize. I had written a few lessons. This was a few months back now. I had written 3 or 4 lessons of this material, and I sent it to Ronnie, and I said, would you look over this and just kind of see if you're tracking with me? Like, is what I've written, does it make sense? And so he gave me some feedback, which was helpful, and some suggestions, and included in his feedback was that statement in your material, that there is no home without a wilderness. And that's exactly right, and that's what we're trying to convey this quarter. So we sing that song, Here We Are But Straying Pilgrims. I can't sing that song without thinking of a funny story that I'll share with you. When I was preaching in Alabama, we were coming upon the Sunday before Thanksgiving. And so the song leader, who was on the schedule for that Sunday, he texted me. He was a really good friend of mine, and he said, Ben, what are you preaching Sunday? Do you need me to do songs that are, kind of Thanksgiving-oriented? No, I'm not doing a Thanksgiving sermon. Just, pick whatever songs you want. And he said, well, here's what I'm thinking. And he sent me a lineup of some of the Thanksgiving songs, okay? Here we are but straying pilgrims. 'Tis set the feast divine. All things are ready. Come to the feast. And of course, he was joking, but I thought that was really funny. And then I challenged him, and I said, if you led all of those songs, I wonder how many people would pick up on it. But he didn't have the guts to do it, so we never found out. Wilderness people are pilgrim people. And as we're going to talk about tonight, the mentality of a pilgrim is different from the mentality of a permanent resident. The Bible tells us that we are to be pilgrims in this world, and therefore we should think and speak and act accordingly. I included in your material this text from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 16, which talks about Abraham. And I want to put this up on the screen with you, because as I was thinking about this verse, or these verses rather, in recent days, something of an outline came into my mind. I hope you can see the color variation on this. I want you to consider these elements in this passage. Beginning in verse 8, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. we see here the trust that Abraham had in God. In Genesis chapter 12, God speaks to Abraham and says, get up, leave your country, leave your homeland, and go to a place that I will show you. And it took tremendous faith on Abraham's part to do that, to pack up all of his possessions, his family, and just start walking, having no idea where he was going. But as he was doing this, verse 9 tells us that by faith he was living as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. I think that says something about Abraham's perspective. He was living as an alien. He knew that he was in a foreign land. And that's true both literally and figuratively. He is literally in a foreign land, a physical place that was different from his homeland. But the text is going to go on to say more about this perspective that Abraham has. And as he is making his way through this foreign land, they are living in tents, this nomadic lifestyle. But then in verse 10, the text says that he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He's living in tents. He's living in a structure that's temporary, that's movable. But he's looking for a place that has foundations, permanence. He's looking for a place that has a structure, as opposed to that tent that he's living in from day to day. And that passage says something about his goal. And so does verse 14. Those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. That speaks to the goal that Abraham had. And in verse 16, it says that he desires a better country, a heavenly one. And in verse 13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, having confessed they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Again, that idea of a foreigner, someone who doesn't belong here. Abraham understood that, and this speaks of his perspective. And these three elements, trust, perspective, and a goal, I think these three things are critical for us today, just as they were for Abraham. As we are making our way through the wilderness, we have to have trust in God. We talked about that in the first lesson in this segment. The kind of people that we must be a people who trust. And it is so difficult to trust when you're in the midst of the wilderness. But we have to, as Abraham did. And we have to keep our focus. We have to keep our perspective, understanding that the wilderness is temporary. That what we're experiencing is not permanent. It's not going to last forever, but it's transitory. And if we can keep that perspective, then we can keep our eyes on the goal, which is permanent, which is on the other side of the wilderness. Now let's go back to Genesis chapter 12. Let's talk a little bit more about Abraham and kind of flesh some of these ideas out a little bit more. In Genesis chapter 12, I've given you three passages: Genesis 12, Genesis 13, and then Genesis 22. And this is the first question in your material, but I asked you to look at these passages and look for words or ideas or expressions that convey this idea that Abraham is a pilgrim in his life. So in Genesis chapter 12, I referenced this a moment ago, but verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him. And Lot, his nephew, was with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Now, the next few verses talk about how Abram gathered up all of his possessions and took all of his family, and they set out, and they were making their way to the land of Canaan, which, of course, is where the Israelites were ultimately trying to go when they made it through their wilderness journey. But what words or expressions or thoughts do you see in these verses that talk about Abraham's perspective as a foreigner, as a traveler, as a nomad? What do you see here that talks about his perspective? You need me to get you some water later? You okay? All right. Joe?
How it starts with get out of your country from your family, from your father's house. It just indicates that he was kind of at a stable location, was comfortable, so to speak, in an established place. And so he was being called to basically leave all of that.
Okay. So God calls him to leave everything that he knows, his homeland, his family, extended family. Obviously, his immediate family would go with him. But he's leaving things that he's known all of his life, and he's going to a new place. Now, if Abraham doesn't have the right perspective in this, then it would be very easy for him to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm comfortable here. It's safer here. It's easier here. I'm established here. Why would I uproot everything and go? But he says, God told me to do this, and so I'm going to do it. I've mentioned this already, but as they're traveling, what is his living condition? He's living in a tent, right? In verse 8, it says that he proceeded from there to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent. And there, verse 8, he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Verse 9, Abraham journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. He is in this tent. He is moving about, not staying in any place very long. It is this very transitory kind of existence. Moving his family, moving his possessions. We know from chapter 13 that Abraham had many flocks and herds. He has a lot of possessions. And he is moving all of these things, these animals and all of his possessions on a regular basis. But there is something that we notice as we go through this, that as Abraham is pitching his tent and then packing up his tent and moving to the next place, you come to chapter 13 and verse 3. It says something about where his tent had been at the beginning. That's what we just read about in chapter 12. Then verse 4, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly. Again, we just read about that in chapter 12. Moving about in tents, worshiping at altars, constructing altars in various places. In chapter 13 and verse 18, Abram moved his tent, and he came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. You see this pattern as you look through Abraham's life. He packs up his tent, he goes to a new place. He sets up his tent, he builds an altar, he worships God. He stays there for a little while. He packs up his tent, he moves everything to a new place, he sets up his tent, he builds an altar, he worships God. Abraham was truly singing, "This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through." And every time he built that altar, he said, "My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue." This is a lifestyle pattern that we see in Abraham. So when we see this pattern, tent, altar, it shouldn't surprise us then when we come to chapter 22. And God says, I need you to make another altar. And this is going to be the most difficult sacrifice that you've ever been asked to offer. So while Abraham's earthly home was always changing, his heavenly focus was always fixed. And this mentality that he has, where he trusts God to do whatever God says, he keeps his perspective about him, knowing that God is not going to ask him to do this permanently, that he's going to be moving about one place to the next, but he has a goal in mind. And that goal, maybe he won't even see it until he gets to heaven. But that's his ultimate goal. This is a great example for us. So let's contrast a little bit. Question number 2, the life of a pilgrim and the life of a permanent resident. What differences exist between pilgrims and permanent residents in terms of attitude, outlook, approach to life, etc.? Let's talk a little bit about this. Several of you in here have moved recently, within the last couple of years. Charles, did you enjoy that? No, of course you didn't. Of course not. We don't want to move across town, much less move clear across the country like you did. That's difficult. It's not easy to do that. It's expensive. It's time-consuming. It's tiring. Moving about is difficult.
We won't tell Diana.
She knows. She knows. Diana's moved enough to know the challenges, right? Contrast these attitudes and the outlook in life that pilgrims have from permanent residents. Okay. Okay. Charles' comment was that there's a complacency that comes with a permanent dwelling. If you've lived in the same house for 40 years, you've accumulated stuff, and that's not all bad, but you've accumulated stuff over the years, and your estate has grown in that place, and it's just what you become familiar with. It's what you know. It's home. There's a complacency element there. And not just complacency in a bad sense. I know that's usually the way we talk about the idea. There is something very attractive about being settled and home, right? That there's something really nice about that. And God would say that too. He would just say, don't do that here. All right, Brian?
Well, I'd say that a pilgrim has a focus is a lot higher.
Okay.
He's looking at, life outside of this temporary home that we're at. So his focus is higher. So because it's higher, no matter where he goes, he's going to have the same focus. If you move a lot, it's hard sometimes to get focused to the new place that you're at. But if you come and go there based off a higher being and a higher reach, then it's a lot easier to do.
Okay. All right. So Brian said that the pilgrim's focus is on an elevated plane, that there's something higher there. It's kind of a shame the Mollers are not here tonight. They've moved like 36 times or something, and they know a lot about that. And this kind of pilgrim mentality was something that they were forced to possess because of Alan's career in the military. Alan's weird, though. He loved it. Most of us don't like that. Dad, did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
I hope he's not watching. Sorry, Alan.
When you're settled, you have an identity. You can say, these are my people. Abraham did not have that.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. This is my place. These are my people. Abraham, well, he did have that, but he left that in order to not have that. And that's a difficult thing to do, for sure. All right, what else? Wayne?
In the case of a pilgrim, there may be, or probably are, could be rewards for the choices you make to move, and it could also be issues that come up. I'll remind you of the fact that they escaped the famine by moving away from it, and then when he was going into Egypt, he had to basically give up his wife, I guess, to the men of Egypt because she was a beautiful woman, and they would have killed him if he had not.
Right, you're talking about Abraham, yeah.
So there's sacrifices you make, and there's maybe rewards that you get.
Yeah. And what Abraham has to keep in mind is God called me to do this, and he made this promise to me, substantial promises. And even if I don't fully understand what all is involved in those promises, I have to believe that what God has called me to is greater than what he's asking me to leave. Abraham believed that, and we have to believe the same thing. There is a different attitude in regards, when a pilgrim comes to a new place, a pilgrim says, don't get too attached. I'm not staying here long. This is only a short while. There's people like a traveling nurse, for instance, who goes to a new area for maybe a 6 or a 12-month stay. They don't buy a house. That wouldn't make sense. They find a place to rent because they need something for the short term. It's a completely different mentality when you approach that new location than it is the person who is intending to be the permanent resident. Now, Peter's going to bring up something else, another part of our mentality. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter talks about our attitude as pilgrims and strangers. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 11, Peter brings up something else that it is very important for us to remember as pilgrims. 1 Peter 2 and verse 11, he says, "Beloved, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, because of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation." Stay away from the lusts of the flesh, the things that the world has to offer. Because as aliens and strangers, those things should not appeal to us. We need to watch out for those things. Those are things that keep us tied to the earth, things that draw our attention to the world. And Peter says, stay away from those things, because our attention is not to be in the world. It is to be in the next world. It is to be in that heavenly realm. And people in this world will see our behavior as we say, no, I'm not going to participate in that. No, thank you. I'm going to pass on that behavior. People in the world will see that, and then they will, he says in verse 12, slander you as an evildoer. They will say bad things about you. Well, he's different. They'll mock you. They'll make fun of you. He talks about this at a few places in the book, where people of the world will not understand this mentality that we have. A worldly person says, I've got one life. I've got one shot to have all the fun that I can get. This world is all there is, and I'm going to get it and milk it for all it's worth. But when we don't do that, it baffles that person. It doesn't make any sense to them. And because they don't understand us, Peter says they will speak evil of us. I want to suggest to you that those verses 11 and 12, are really a thesis for where Peter goes in the rest of the book. In verse 9, let me back up and include these verses too. He says, "But you," talking to Christians, "are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession." This is who you are. Then verse 11, "And this is how you behave. This is what you ought to do. Avoid these fleshly lusts." But then, through the rest of the book, he talks about specific areas of life where Christians live in a different way from people of the world. So in verse 13, he talks about how we are to submit to the government and the authorities that God has put into place. In verse 18, he talks about servants being submissive to their masters, even those who are hateful and evil. In chapter 3, in verse 1, he talks about wives being submissive to their husbands, even those who are disobedient and may not be the best of men. Why would you do this? Why would, chapter 3 and verse 7, husbands treat their wives in the way that Peter says in that passage? Why would you do that? Because I'm a Christian, and this is what Christ tells me to do. And this world is not my home, and that affects the way that I live while I'm here. People of the world don't understand this, but this is how pilgrims think. This is how pilgrims live, because this is what God has called us to do. All right, Let's shift gears a little bit. So we think about the Israelites again, who first, as Wayne said a moment ago, back in Joseph's time, they went to Egypt seeking bread. There was a famine in their land. They went to the land of Egypt to find food, to find life. And when they did that, Joseph's family was greeted warmly because of who Joseph was. The Pharaoh respected Joseph. He valued Joseph's opinion. And when Joseph's family came in Genesis chapter 47, Pharaoh said to Joseph, verses 5 and 6, "Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know any capable men among them, then put them in charge of my livestock." So Joseph settled his father and brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had ordered. What a blessing to be able to go to this new land, to find not just food, but life, to settle in, to establish themselves as first as families, but then as a people, as a nation that would grow from this family. But you know the history. 400 years goes by. Joseph's family multiplies, and they multiply, and they become an exceedingly large nation. And a new Pharaoh comes along who is scared of this sizable people in his land. And that's when Moses comes and says, it's time to get out of here. God has called us to a new land, which is really not a new land at all. It's the land of Canaan, where Abraham wandered and sojourned centuries before. That land is where God wants to bring his people. Now he wants to take them out of the best of the land to bring them, if they can believe it, to an even better place in Canaan. But there's going to be some hardship involved in that transition. So Moses comes to the land of Egypt again, the place of his birth and his upbringing. He says to Pharaoh, you remember, you can hear Charlton Heston, let my people go. And the 10 plagues and all the story, we're familiar with that. So finally, the will of Pharaoh is broken. Yes, get them out of here, as he is mourning for his firstborn. And in Exodus chapter 13, I've always found this to be an interesting passage. Exodus 13, the people are on their way out of the land. And in verse 17, when Pharaoh had let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, even though it was near. If you can picture in your mind a map of the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt down here, moving up to Canaan and Israel, northeast from Egypt, the most direct path that they could have taken was to follow along the Mediterranean Sea. If you can't see that, look in the back of your Bible. You may have a map back there. It might help you. The most direct path would have been to go along the Great Sea. But that's not where God wanted them to go. Even though it was closer, even though it was shorter, God does not lead them there. Why doesn't he do that? That's where the Philistines are. And I take it that the Israelites are not ready to fight the Philistines at this point. Maybe militarily, they are just not in a position to do that. They haven't been in Egypt all this time training to be soldiers. They've been making pyramids. They've been making bricks out of dirt and grass. So God doesn't want them to go through the land of the Philistines. He says they'll be afraid. The Philistines are a strong nation. So that's not the way they're going to go. It would discourage them. So God is going to lead them south, down towards the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, instead of taking the course through the Philistines' territory. And in Exodus 13, and in verse 20, it says that they set out from Succoth and they camped in Etham on the edge of the wilderness. And the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people. Moses, why don't we go this way? Don't you have a map? Don't you have a GPS, Moses? Why are you taking us south? The journey's going to be 15 times longer if we go that way. Not to mention, it's just desert down there. Yeah. But this is where God says we need to go. And God is with them the whole time, day and night. There's never a time that He is not with them. I've thought about this for a while. You know, sometimes God takes people the long way home, so to speak. We say the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, but God doesn't always operate in straight lines. And He has His reasons for that. And as the Israelites are griping and complaining about, why are we spending all this time in the wilderness, Moses? You led us out here to die. Man, we had things so great back in Egypt, you know, when they were cracking whips on our backside. It was wonderful. Why are you leading us this way? This is not the fastest way. I know that. Moses said, I know. But you see that? That's God. You see that big ball of fire right there? That's God's presence. And that's what we follow. That cloud that's moving in front of us, that's what we follow. It doesn't matter if this way seems shorter or this way seems better. We're following God's presence, because in God's presence is His powerful protection. And it doesn't matter where we are geographically. If God is with us, then we're in the best place we can possibly be. So that as the Israelites are making their way to this new best of the land, God promises to be with them and to protect them. But do you wonder, if the Israelites did not spend so much time in the wilderness, would they have fully appreciated what they got on the other side? And I think there might be a lesson for us there. I think all of us were reminded yesterday, as 21 people at an elementary school in Texas were killed, that this world is a wilderness, that bad things happen here, that there are bad people here who do bad things. And it is the stories like that that we talked about in our very first lesson. Watch the news. Look at all the tragedy that's out there. The things that bring us to tears here are at least a part of what helps us look forward to the fact that there's no tears there. The sorrow and the heartaches here help us appreciate the fact that those things will not be present there. You with me? Let's not pray that God always gives us the shortest route. that He always gives us the easiest path. Instead, let us pray, God, whatever path you send me on, just be with me. Just be with me. All right. Thanks, everybody.